From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek studio, PBS Kansas presents Kansas Week.
Cutting Kansas teens off from the tobacco pipeline to save the state money. Plus, the fight over the death penalty moves from the State House to a Sedgwick County courtroom. But first, school choice bills leading to clashes among lawmakers.
And I would just have to say again, holy tax scams.
Stop.
All week long. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. I'm Pilar Pedraza, and this is Kansas Week. We knew education would become a battleground at the State House this year. Those battles turning into occasional firefights this week.
We're not going to do these holy moly statements. This is not a time to grandstand. This is time to ask questions to the revisor.
My question: if a wealthy family can take advantage of both programs,
Representative.
So, what's all the hubbub about? We begin with Cakes Jackson Overstreet and an overview of the various school choice bills on the table this week.
It's a busy time for Life Prep Academy. The private K-12 school is moving to a new building after its enrollment has increased significantly over the last few years.
I think one thing COVID showed us was that not every school was fitting the needs of every child.
And its enrollment could continue to expand. The Kansas legislature is looking at a series of bills Republicans say would increase school choice. It's something Life Prep's president Rob Ratola supports.
Ultimately, it creates competition in schools. And a competition's good. A rising tide lifts all ships.
One of the bills works by giving families who pull their kids from public schools an educational savings account. The funds would come from public school tax dollars. Those families could use that money to pay for tuition at private schools like Life Prep. Organizations against the bill see it as taking away resources from public schools that need help.
If those kids leave the public school system, then the public schools have that much less. They have a lower head count and a higher proportion of the kids that are more expensive to educate. So it does hurt the rest of the kids remaining in the public schools.
Republicans have been pushing hard for school choice this legislative session, but just how likely is it to pass? Both chambers would have to override a potential veto from Governor Laura Kelly to put the program into law, something political experts say is unlikely.
There are going to be moderate Republicans that have more sympathy towards public schooling and public school financing.
And joining us to discuss this and other issues this week, we've got a full slate of panelists. We have with us state lawmakers, It is one of those weeks, guys. Nick Hoheisel, State Representative, Republican from Wichita, and John Carmichael, State Representative and Democrat from Wichita. And of course, we also have a journalist, managing editor of the Harvey County Now, Adam Strunk. Good Lord, I can't talk this week, guys. And Dr. Russell Arbin Fox, political analyst from Friends University, who you just saw in that story. So I'm going to start with you guys, actually. This is not a new issue, educational savings accounts, vouchers. We've heard them called different things over the years, but it's an issue that continues to come up at the legislature, Russell.
It comes up in our legislature in the same way that it's come up in state legislatures all across the country. And depending on how you approach these bills, different arguments are advanced. I think fundamentally the reason why these are continuing debates is because people have very, very distinct philosophical takes on what is the whole point of public education. So that in one of the stories about one of the bills, the Kansas Policy Institute released a statement talking about how the purpose of bills like this is to make sure that parents get their return on investment when it comes to public schooling. Now, obviously, if you're talking about some kind of private financial investment, ROI is an appropriate model to bring up. But a lot of people don't look at public schools that way. They think of it in terms of a civic good. And they don't like the idea that we're going to approach that civic good in terms of maximizing one particular individual or one particular family's investment within it. And so as long as you've got these philosophical disagreements, bills of this type, vouchers, educational saving accounts, and so forth, they're going to continue to kick around.
So what do we think, guys? We know Russell thinks that there's a good chance this won't make it through because of moderate Republicans and the governor's veto. What about our lawmakers? What are you thinking? Nick?
Yeah, I think there's a decent shot this doesn't become law. There are a number of moderate Republicans, particularly in western Kansas, rural Kansas, where public education is the only education they have out there. So a lot of times you'll see moderate Republicans band with Democrats to sustain vetoes on education policy such as this.
No disagreement at all. Dr. Fox lays out what the two competing views are, and Nick has properly described exactly what the political situation is. This is fanfare and circus, and it makes some conservative Republican base real excited to watch this foolish hearing we've had this week. But in the end, I don't think this goes anywhere.
I will, if I can disagree on one thing with my friend, the representative, and the good professor, is I do believe that there are folks who view this as a well-intended solution to education. I know folks who will support this bill who also support public education. They don't think it's binary, one or the other. They want all solutions on the table when it comes to fixing education in Kansas. And I do believe that they're viewing this and working on this issue from a good spot.
And describing it as a binary actually provides support for the point you made earlier about people in western Kansas. I mean, obviously, this is only the sort of thing that is a real live issue to people who live in urban areas where there's enough population to sustain a variety of approaches to education. If you live in a rural county way out in western Kansas, you don't want any money to leave the public school pool because you know that there isn't going to be any other options available for you out there.
Yeah.
Well, and as you and I know, Adam, we've got districts where even a little bit of money gone can end up being a major problem, leading to consolidation, which we already have counties that only have one school district for the entire county.
Well, and I mean, this is a topic that we're dealing with quite a bit at the paper now, just due to enrollment numbers and changes. We have a number of private schools within our community. We also have parents who've chose to homeschool. We have some schools with enrollment down. In Newton, we are talking about possible consolidation. Burton is talking about a 4-day school week, in part because of enrollment. So these are issues that they're really, really they're thinking of regularly, and they're having conversations on how do we respond to this.
And we haven't even discussed special needs children,
which don't have to be taken at some of these schools.
Precisely, private schools can pick and choose their students and educate the best and the brightest, leave the children with learning disabilities behind to be educated in a public school. But we can't have equal educational opportunity under those sorts of circumstances.
Now, John, you're known for your feistiness, and we all love you for it.
Oh, thank you.
We had some dust-ups between Representative Mary Lynn Poskin and Representative Christy Williams this week. It really seems that for some folks, this has become a very personal issue.
Here's what's disappointing about this is committees that Nick and I have been on, I can think of Judiciary, we have serious principled discussions, but we don't have carnivals like what we've watched this past week. That's not good for the legislature. It's not good policy making. It's unfortunate. And frankly, it's an embarrassment to me as a part of the legislature when I see a committee hearing ran the way the chairwoman has run those hearings.
I will say though, when it comes to education, passions run high, and so it's not rare, and when we're talking serious, passionate issues, for tempers to run a little hot in there.
Kind of why we have in the Senate rules, like you can't even address the others specifically. You have to use their, the senator from Johnston County instead of their name and stuff like that.
Though sometimes I wonder if those procedural rules can't themselves become an obstacle. I see nods over there.
They are. We could do a whole show on this.
Yeah, and the Senate altogether becomes an obstacle, but
Amen.
That's a
Amen.
different discussion for a different
we're
day.
going to table that discussion right there. The future of the Kansas death penalty is now in the hands of a Sedgwick County judge after a week-long hearing on it in Wichita. The ACLU raised 3 concerns about the death penalty. The judge's immediate concern, an argument over whether questions used to determine who's on the jury automatically ends up seating a biased jury that eliminates the peers of minority, especially African-American defendants.
Lynching is racialized violence. Lynching is when you're sending a message. This is a spectacle. That's a scarring effect. The sense is history is stamped on skin. It just doesn't appear. The effect is intergenerational. That sense of trauma, discrimination, inevitably leads to mistrust, distrust.
The ACLU's argument that distrust leads to answers that get potential jurors of color, specifically black candidates, kicked out before a jury is even seated.
So when you are in the trial for your life, you will face a jury that is more conviction prone, more likely to return a death sentence, and much more likely to be whiter.
You have to have people who say, I would be open-minded and consider it. I might not, I might. That's, in very broad terms, that's what death qualification means.
The ACLU's attorneys also say the death penalty in Kansas is unfairly applied. Sedgwick County District Attorney Mark Bennett arguing back the numbers don't support that.
202 times a black person killed a white person in Kansas. Prosecutors should have been rushing to those cases and saying capital murder every time. And the number's either 2 or 3 out of 202.
And the ACLU says capital punishment violates the state's constitutional protection of a right to life. The judge agreed to rule on the first argument about seating jurors before jury selection begins at the end of summer in the Kyle Young double murder capital trial. Now, the waiting game begins as both sides look to what's the next step.
My own goal is to see that death qualification never goes forward in another capital trial in Kansas. However that is achieved, I think what we've shown here is that death qualification is an unconstitutional process.
No one case affects other cases at this level. Appeal it to the Supreme Court. If they agreed, then we don't have death penalty anymore.
Well, let's start with the death qualification question that was raised there. When I spoke with Mark Bennett afterward, he said, we hear challenges in every capital case. These are not new. The arguments are not new. And yet the ACLU was very specific. These are new studies. We have new data and new information that's going to change the game.
Part of the information is new, but part of it was also a legal and political calculation that this is the sort of case, and in particular, in light of recent state Supreme Court decisions, this is an opportunity to push forward a multifaceted argument against the death penalty. And so that's why you see, national organizations and some national attention all focusing here on this particular challenge to the state law. The story itself and the arguments that were made down at the Sedgwick County Courthouse tended to focus particularly on the issue of jury selection, because I think they see that as the wedge issue, the one that they're going to be able to make the most progress on with the judge in terms of making an argument that, the selection of juries for capital cases is reflecting a racial bias. But obviously as was said, their ultimate goal is to take the law itself off the books.
John?
We've had a problem in Sedgwick County with juries which do not reflect the demographics of the community for a long time. Back in the 90s, the Wichita Bar Association did a survey, and they found that very few people of color were on juries in our county. Some changes have been made in the jury pool and how they're selected, but the bottom line still is that minorities, people of color, are underrepresented. That's part of the argument here, and that's one that's been dealt with for a long time. But what they're also arguing is societal factors cause the people who make it on to a capital jury to have more faith or credibility in the process, and those who are of minority groups, they don't make the cut. Now, Judge Gehring is an excellent judge. I've tried cases with him. I have nothing but, by the way, he's a Republican member of the House too, but he's a good judge. But this argument isn't really being made for Judge, I'm sorry, did I say something foolish?
No, the way you phrased it was very nice.
Judge Gehring, though, this isn't being tried for him. This is being tried to make an appellate record. And he's probably going to find that we should impanel a jury and go forward with a trial. But what's being developed here, judges on appellate courts don't just make decisions out of the air and use their own personal belief. They look at evidence. And so there is new scientific evidence. It's continuing to evolve. And so the record needs to be made. And that's what's happening here. This trial is going to go forward. They're preserving a record on appeal.
And that was kind of the attitude that the district attorney, almost gave him a raise to attorney general there. The district attorney was making when I spoke with him. All right, moving on. Basic pay in Kansas could soon go up, at least if one state lawmaker has his way, but not everyone agrees with him. Alyssa Storm from the KSN Capitol Bureau explains.
Last week, Democrat Senator Ethan Corson introduced Senate Bill 70, the Making Work Pay Act, with the hope of increasing minimum wage as early as next year. The bill would raise minimum wage in Kansas to $10 starting next year. Then it would continue to gradually increase by $2 each year until it reaches $16 in 2027. Right now, minimum wage in Kansas is set at $7.25 an hour. That hasn't changed since 2010. Corson says it's just not enough to live on in today's economy.
In this country, I don't think that you should be working full-time and be living in poverty or be dependent upon the government for government assistance. So I think anybody who works full-time should have the dignity of getting a living wage that allows them to support themselves and to support their family.
But not everyone is in full support of the bill. State Senator John Dahl, a Republican, agrees workers should make a livable wage. He warns increasing minimum wage is a double-edged sword, saying when wages go up, so do the cost of goods, which could lead to another cycle of inflation.
A person that's working and has a full-time job should get a livable wage. But on the other side of the coin, that's why we're paying a lot more for Big Macs and quarter pounders with cheese. You know, it's hard to get a cheap meal.
So what kind of businesses would this bill affect the most? Small businesses. Andrew Howard, owner of Round Table Bookstore, says that while he pays his employees more than minimum wage, not all small business owners can.
Small businesses have a very finite amount of capital that they can pay. We're fortunate enough that we can start our employees at $10 an hour. So it hopefully won't affect us, but I know that not every small business is that lucky.
Howard says he thinks of his employees as a family, so paying them more is just one way he can show his appreciation.
Now, not exactly a new bill. Jim Ward used to introduce it every single year. We've seen the arguments before. It always has failed, at least as long as I've been covering the State House. But is there perhaps more willingness to consider it now that we've got this ongoing fight over too few employees out there?
I don't think so. I don't think there's a huge rush in Topeka right now to consider this, because I think most people in Topeka view this as the free market's working already. I mean, Spangles, any fast food place, they're starting off $11, $12 an hour. Part of that is because of the inflation in the economy, but we view this as the market is working. Wages are rising on their own, so why should the government intervene and raise them on our behalf?
The corollary, of course, is if that's the case, then it won't hurt anybody to go ahead and put a $10 floor on minimum wage, because the economic factors, it's costing more than that already.
I would be interested to see on the data on how many folks in Kansas are actually making minimum wage right now. I think that would be interesting to look at.
I mean, there are plenty of Kansas workers who are doing entry-level jobs who are still getting $7.25 an hour. But you're right that economic pressures and the need to attract workers have caused a lot of businesses, including a lot of small businesses, to really figure out how can they, squeeze enough money out of, their limited profit margins in order to pay the amount that's necessary. For every story there is about somebody who's working some job and they can barely pay their bills despite working full time. You got other stories about small businesses that are really struggling to hold on to their employees and figure out how to pay the wages. I mean, frankly, in the wake of the pandemic, in the wake of all of the disruptions to supply chains, I mean, that's the primary reason why cheeseburgers are costing more. It's not a labor issue. It's primarily an issue of trying to get the raw materials that business owners need. In the wake of all this, I think that we're still in real flux, not just here in Kansas, but nationally. Whether or not this flux is an appropriate time to push for a formal minimum wage increase within the state of Kansas, I think ultimately that has to depend upon something other than raw financial calculations. Maybe it just becomes a question of justice. You take a look at Kansas's minimum wage, and it's been 13 years since that wage was bumped.
Practically, though, bigger part of the problem right now is part-time unbenefited jobs, people who work 2 part-time jobs. They don't qualify for any of the benefits of full-time employment. They don't make a living wage, even if they're making $10 an hour or $12 an hour, but they're not working 40 hours a week. They don't have benefits, and that's a problem as well.
That was a more in-depth conversation than I was expecting on that topic. Kansas could lose millions in federal grant dollars if it doesn't cut off teenage smokers. Kansas still hasn't raised its minimum age for buying tobacco from 18 to 21 in order to bring it in line with federal laws. We go back to Jackson Overstreet with a look at how some lawmakers are taking another stab at making this change.
Step inside smokestacks on 21st Street and you'll see plenty of different things you can buy.
We sell tobacco, we sell chips and candy, smoking accessories, all kinds of different things.
But if you want any of those tobacco products, you need to be 21.
Well, the FDA does come in and do undercover inspections. So if we were to sell to the wrong person, we would get shut down and lose our business.
21 and older rule is federal law that was passed back in 2019. However, in Kansas, state law is still technically 18. And that difference could cause some problems for the Department of Aging and Disability Services.
KDADS is at risk for about $1.2 million in loss from the 10% cut to the Substance Abuse Prevention and Treatment Block Grant.
That grant comes from the federal government and could be withheld if the state does not change its laws to be 21 and over. Thursday, the House Federal and State Committee discussed a bill that would do just that.
You know, some of the backlash on this has been some of the lost revenue that we'll see from tobacco sales in the amount of $3 to $5 million. I assure you the amount of money that we'll save in healthcare costs will be many factors over that.
There have been bills like this one in previous years that haven't passed. But lawmakers say with money that goes to programs like youth tobacco prevention on the line.
And we need to do this. And you know we need to do this at the core of it.
And we know that some communities, yours, Newton, has already kind of done this.
Yeah, it was led up by a local youth initiative. I, as a journalist, thought it was going to be a pretty contentious issue because, you know, people do care about that, and there was no outcry. I even talked to some of the local vape shops, some of those shops. There wasn't a big upsetness with it. And we ought to be clear that right now federal law is you have to be 21 to purchase tobacco, and that kind of still applies to the state of Kansas.
Yeah, so even this is more of a paperwork issue
than
a practical issue.
this is so we can get some grant funding so we can just clean this up, but yeah.
All right. We'll have to wait and see what happens with that bill. Meanwhile, the Caldwell Regional Medical Center opened its doors this week after more than 50 years in an aging building. Doctors say the upgrade will mean a world of difference to patients. We go back to Jackson Overstreet for more.
Deep breath.
Doctors and patients are settling in here at the brand new Caldwell Regional Medical Center. The new building is a major upgrade over the old hospital that was on the other side of town.
I've had to travel to other towns to have treatment, and this facility can handle all of the new treatments that we had to go out of town for.
Plans for this hospital started in 2019, and the new building was needed. It is twice the size of the old hospital, and with the upgrades, Caldwell Regional is able to offer many more services to patients.
We're able to expand our outpatient infusions, antibiotic therapies, our blood transfusions. We can offer iron. Not to mention we've also added lots of outpatient therapies.
This new building has the hospital, clinic, and emergency room all in the same location, which doctors say makes it so much easier to treat patients from start to end.
If our patients need that higher level of care, we're able to provide that all in-house without needing to have them sent off to other facilities.
Caldwell Regional is also the only hospital in Sumner County, and so if patients couldn't get the treatment they needed there, they would have to drive an hour away to Wichita. Now, administrators say having so many more services available in town should make it easier for people to take care of themselves.
If patients don't have access to health care right here locally, they're not going to keep up with their health.
In Caldwell, Jackson Overstreet, KIC News on your side.
Well, we know healthcare is a scarce resource in our rural communities. This perhaps one initiative that could change things, but is it something really that can be translated to other rural counties? Anybody?
Oh, I'd say ask the legislators, because I know that, Medicaid expansion is something that comes up over and over and over again. I'm sure that would be an issue that would play into rural health care. I mean, we do have rural hospitals that have closed in Kansas. It's sometimes difficult to keep quality staff. We just talked about staffing. It's difficult to keep these up at a high level. So I couldn't speak on Caldwell, but I think it is a big issue for the state of Kansas.
Part of the reason why you can connect it to issues like Medicaid expansion and so forth is because that's a program that, for whatever limitations it has, is delivering funds directly to already existing medical providers. Exactly. When you're looking at something here, you had enough of a commercial base, enough of a population base for there to be tax incentive districts set up and money to be raised to do the expansion of the hospital. In truly rural and low population areas, outside of actually providing direct assistance to the few already existing medical providers, I don't know if we can, as wonderful as this is, I don't know if we can take it as a model for the rest of Western Kansas.
Okay, lawmakers, what are your thoughts?
Well, this isn't a panacea. It is a big problem, and we have depopulation in Western Kansas. We have a move to where more and more legislators are from Wichita, Topeka, Kansas City, metropolitan areas. There's less political clout in these communities in the legislature, and it's important for people like Nick and I. And by the way, I know Nick recognizes this. We've got to remember that we represent all of Kansas. We've got to distribute resources in a way so that health care is available to every Kansan. And if that means that, number one, we approve Medicaid expansion in Kansas, and we devote resources from the state to support the entirety of the state, we really can't be successful as a state if we don't do that. We can't have a vast unpopulated wasteland west of 81.
Yeah, so the last 2 years I spent in the House as Vice Chairman of the Financial Institutions and Rural Development Committee. In that committee, when we talked about the rural development side, we did talk a lot about healthcare. And I know in the last couple of years we passed the APRN bill to try to get some healthcare out there to Western Kansas. But it is an ongoing issue, and it is on the forefront, on the front of the minds of both rural legislators and urban legislators like John and I. It's a continuing discussion in Topeka when we talk about getting folks back into Western Kansas. This one comes up, and hopefully we have more ideas to address
I think Nick would agree that just approving an independent APRN practice bill doesn't solve the problem.
Doesn't solve, but it definitely helps.
And we're going to leave it right there because we are out of time, folks. Thank you so much, Nick, John, Adam, and Russell for joining me this week. I hope you also have enjoyed our discussion. We'd also like to thank our news partners at KSN News, the Wichita Eagle, and Cake News for sharing their materials with us. We'd love to know what you think of this discussion or your ideas for future shows. Just drop us a line at kansasweek@kpts.org. For now, stay safe and have a great week.